Welcome back for part 2 of our deep dive into modern Indian history.
A crucial subject if you're prepping for the UPSC GS1 exam.
Or if you're just fascinated by India's journey.
Last time we laid the groundwork.
Now we're zooming in on how the British Raj tried to control the narrative.
Specifically through committees on the press.
Committees.
Intrigued.
Hit that subscribe button.
This is a story with twists you won't expect.
Okay.
What's fascinating here is that these committees weren't always about censorship.
Really?
It was more nuanced,
Okay.
reflecting the push and pull between British authority and the emerging voice of India.
So maybe committees isn't the sexiest term.
True.
But think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Who gets to tell the story?
Good point.
Whose voices are amplified and whose are silenced?
Yeah,
That's power, right?
absolutely.
And in British India,
Right.
that power struggle played out in the world of newspapers, pamphlets, anything people read.
Absolutely. The British saw the press as this double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a tool to spread their ideas of progress.
Nice.
On the other, it could be used against them to fuel dissent and nationalist movements.
So how did they try to manage this?
Well,
I mean, did they just shut down any publication they didn't like?
Not quite. That's where these committees come in.
Okay.
They acted as a sort of regulatory mechanism,
Uh-huh.
a way to influence what got printed and how it was framed.
All right. Let's get specific.
Okay.
Where do we even start with this timeline of committees?
Our first stop is 1835,
Okay.
a time when, even in Britain, press freedom was being debated.
Interesting.
Lord William Bentinck,
Uh-huh.
the Governor General, sets up a press commission.
Okay.
Now, here's the kicker.
Okay.
They actually recommend less restriction on the press.
Hold on. Less.
Less.
I thought this was about the British trying to control the narrative.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
It might seem counterintuitive, but there were liberal voices within the British establishment pushing for a freer press.
Huh?
Even in India. Bentinck himself was known for his reformist views.
All right.
Plus, remember, the East India Company was still a major player at this point. They
Right.
were concerned about anything that might hinder trade or their own autonomy.
So even within the Raj, there were these competing interests, right?
Precisely.
Not everyone agreed on how tightly to control information.
Exactly. And this internal debate played out over decades, as you'll see with the committees that followed.
Yeah.
But things took a turn after the 1857 rebellion.
The Sepoy Mutiny.
Yes, the Sepoy Mutiny.
That must have been a turning point.
It was.
The British were shaken,
Oh, yeah?
and I bet they saw the press as a potential threat to their control.
Exactly. The 1857 rebellion exposed the fragility of British rule, and they became even more wary of anything that could incite unrest.
So after 1857, did things just get more and more restrictive?
Well,
Was it just a steady march towards censorship?
not entirely. Take the Hunter Commission of 1882.
Yeah.
Its primary focus was education.
Right.
But it also dipped its toes into recommending press controls. Like what?
Like licensing publication.
Okay.
They saw a link between education and what people read,
Makes sense.
wanting to shape both.
So even a commission on education was concerned with controlling the press.
Yes.
It shows how much importance they placed on influencing what people were reading and learning.
Exactly. And then came the Welby Commission in 1898,
Okay.
which focused on the legal side.
Uh-huh.
They were obsessed with sedition.
Sedition.
Any writing that could be seen as inciting rebellion against the Raj.
Interesting.
That became a key target for censorship.
Okay, so the screws are tightening. In a way, were there any dissenting voices during this period?
You know, there were.
Really?
Anyone pushing back against these restrictions?
Yeah.
Interestingly, the Simon Commission, which arrived in India in 1927, actually acknowledged that restricting the press was hindering India's political progress.
Wow.
Of course, this commission was looking at a wider range of issues related to Indian self-rule.
But their recognition of the link between a free press and political development was significant.
So even amidst this crackdown, there were those within the British establishment who saw the value of a free press.
It appears so.
That's fascinating.
It shows that the debate wasn't black and white.
Right.
There were always different perspectives at play.
Okay.
But for the most part, the trend was towards greater control, especially as nationalist sentiment grew in India.
But didn't the British eventually have to make some concessions?
They did.
After all, India was moving towards independence?
Yes, and that leads us to the Press Laws Inquiry Committee of 1930,
Okay.
headed by Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru.
Oh, right.
This committee actually led to the Indian Press Act of 1931, which relaxed some of the existing restrictions.
So progress finally.
Maybe.
Was this a genuine attempt to give Indians more freedom of expression?
It's tricky. The British were under immense pressure at this point.
I see.
The independence movement was gaining momentum,
Right.
and they were trying to find ways to appease the growing dissent.
So even these concessions were likely a calculated move to maintain some semblance of control.
It's hard to say for sure, but you have to consider the context. This wasn't some sudden change of heart.
Right.
The British were trying to adapt to a changing political landscape.
Okay, so we've got this back and forth between control and liberalization.
Right.
Where do we land as India approaches independence?
Right on the cusp of independence, we have the Press Commission of 1947,
Okay.
led by Justice Fazl Ali. Now, this one was truly significant.
In what way?
They advocated for the abolition of pre-censorship, which had been a major tool of control.
That makes sense.
Right.
A newly independent nation needs a free press to thrive, right?
Absolutely. This command understood that.
Yeah.
They argued that for India to truly govern itself, the people needed access to uncensored information and a diversity of opinions.
So this commission marks a turning point.
I think so.
A recognition that a free press is essential for a functioning democracy.
Yes.
But how did this shift play out in practice? Did the legacy of these earlier committees just vanish overnight?
Not quite. The story of press freedom in India is far from over.
I bet.
And that brings us to a truly fascinating development, the establishment of the Press Council of India in 1966. The Press Council of India, it's a direct outcome of those colonial committees we've been discussing.
Right.
But instead of the government controlling the press, it's more about journalists regulating themselves.
Now that raises some eyebrows, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, why would journalists want to regulate themselves?
Right.
Doesn't that defeat the purpose of a free press?
You'd think.
You'd think they'd want to push the boundaries, challenge authority.
It's a fair question and one that's been debated for ages.
I bet.
The idea is to strike a balance.
Okay.
To safeguard press freedom while ensuring ethical and responsible journalism.
I see.
It's like they wanted to avoid heavy-handed government control, but also recognize that a completely unchecked press could be problematic.
So walk me through this.
Yeah.
How does the press council actually work?
Okay.
Who's calling the shots?
Think of it like a watchdog, but one made up of journalists themselves.
Okay.
You have a chairperson, typically a retired Supreme Court judge, and 28 members representing various parts of the media, editors, reporters, publishers, you name it.
So it's not just a bunch of government cronies dictating what can be printed.
Not at all. The aim is to have a council that truly understands the media landscape, its pressures, and its responsibilities.
Okay, but what can they actually do?
Well,
I mean, if a newspaper publishes something totally out of line,
right.
can this council just shut them down?
They have some serious authority.
Uh-huh.
They can investigate complaints against publications or journalists,
Okay.
issue warnings,
Right.
or even publicly censure them.
Oh, wow.
In extreme cases, they can recommend suspension of a publication,
Really?
though that's rare.
So there are consequences.
Yes,
But it's more about public accountability than legal action.
I'd say so.
Like they're relying on the shame factor to keep the press in line.
Exactly. The idea is that a newspaper's reputation is its most valuable asset.
Right.
Being publicly criticized by the press council can damage that reputation, leading to loss of trust and readership.
That's interesting. But doesn't that make them vulnerable to outside pressure?
That's a good point.
What's stopping a powerful politician or corporation from influencing their decisions?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
The council's effectiveness hinges on its independence and integrity. And let's be honest, that can be a tough tightrope to walk,
Yeah,
especially in a country as complex as India.
you're right. There are so many competing interests, so much potential for manipulation.
Absolutely.
It makes you think, how much power should a body like this have?
It's an ongoing debate.
I imagine.
Some argue that self-regulation is the best way to protect press freedom,
Okay.
while others say it's not enough to truly hold the media accountable.
So for you listening, think about it.
Right.
Do you trust journalists to police themselves?
Good question.
Or does that sound like a recipe for complacency? And how much government oversight is too much?
It's a tough one.
It's a dilemma with no easy answers.
It is, and it connects directly to the legacy of those colonial committees.
In what way?
You see, they didn't just disappear when India gained independence.
Right.
Their influenced their methods.
Uh-huh.
They left a lasting mark on how the media operates even today.
Okay, let's unpack that.
All right.
What are some of the lasting impacts of those colonial press controls?
Sure.
Did they shape Indian journalism in a fundamental way?
Absolutely. You can't separate the development of Indian journalism from that history of control.
Right.
And eventually, the fight for freedom.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Mhm.
If you're constantly under threat of being shut down or punished for what you write,
Yeah.
it's going to impact your approach to reporting.
You'd be more cautious,
Yes.
maybe self-censored to avoid trouble.
Exactly.
It's like even if the overt control is gone, the fear lingers.
Right. And that's something we still see echoes of today.
Really?
There's a debate about whether this legacy of control has made it harder for a truly robust and independent media to flourish in India.
Mm.
Some argue it's instilled a culture of self-censorship, a reluctance to be too critical of those in power.
That's a sobering thought. It's like even after gaining independence, the ghosts of those colonial restrictions still haunt the newsroom.
In a way.
But isn't that a bit pessimistic?
Maybe.
Hasn't Indian journalism evolved since then?
Of course it has. There's a rich and vibrant media landscape in India.
Okay,
But it's important to acknowledge the context in which it developed.
I see.
The struggle for a free and independent press is an ongoing process.
Right.
And understanding that historical legacy is crucial.
You're saying we can't just ignore those colonial era committees?
That's right.
That they still offer insights into how the media operates today?
Precisely. They raise crucial questions about who controls the narrative, who benefits from certain information being suppressed, and how we as consumers of media can become more discerning and critical.
Okay, that's thought-provoking.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, think about it.
Yeah.
Have you ever encountered a news story and felt like something was missing?
It has.
Like there was another side to the story that wasn't being told?
Absolutely.
Maybe those colonial era tactics are still at play, shaping the information you receive.
It's definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
And as we move into the 21st century with the rise of social media and online news,
Right.
these questions become even more urgent.
It's a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
It is.
We've gone from committees controlling printing presses to algorithms deciding what we see on our phones.
It's a whole new world.
Look at like the battle for control of information has just shifted to a new battlefield.
Exactly. And the stakes are higher than ever.
Wow.
So the question becomes, what does responsible media look like in this new landscape? What is the role of journalists and what is our responsibility as citizens in this age of information overload? It's a question that echoes across centuries, doesn't it?
It really does.
From those colonial era committees trying to control printing presses
Yeah.
to the algorithms shaping our online world today.
Right.
The players may have changed, but the battle for information, for the power to shape narratives,
Right.
that's a constant.
And honestly, it feels more complex than ever.
It really does.
We're bombarded with information from all sides.
Right.
It's hard to know what to trust,
Yeah,
who to believe.
absolutely.
So where do we even begin to unpack this idea of responsible media?
It's a challenge, no doubt.
I bet.
But I think it starts with recognizing that responsibility lies on multiple shoulders.
Okay.
Journalists, of course,
Right.
have a duty to be accurate, fair, and to present a diversity of perspectives.
I see.
But as citizens, we also have a responsibility to be critical consumers of information.
So it's not enough to just passively absorb whatever pops up on our feeds.
Not at all.
We have to be active participants,
Right.
questioning what we see and hear, digging deeper to understand the context and potential biases.
Exactly. Think back to those colonial committees.
Okay.
They were so concerned with sedition,
Right.
with any writing that challenged British authority.
Yeah.
Today, it's not always overt censorship.
I see.
It's more subtle.
Oh,
Algorithms that prioritize certain viewpoints,
right.
echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs,
Huh.
and a constant flood of information that can overwhelm and disorient.
It's like the tools of control has evolved,
They have.
but the goal is often the same.
Right.
To shape public opinion,
Yeah.
to influence how we see the world.
Exactly.
And that's why media literacy is so crucial, right?
It is.
We need the skills to navigate this information landscape,
Right.
to spot misinformation,
Yeah.
to understand how media can be used to manipulate or persuade.
Absolutely. It's about asking critical questions. Who's behind this information? What are their motives?
Yeah,
What perspectives are being included and what's being left out?
makes sense.
These are skills that were relevant back in the days of colonial newspapers.
Right.
And they're even more vital in today's digital world.
It's like the fight for a free and independent press didn't end with Indian independence.
It didn't.
It's an ongoing battle.
It is.
And it's one that we're all a part of, whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just consuming news.
Really?
Think of the stories we share, the content we create,
Right.
the platforms we choose to engage with.
I see.
We're all part of this media ecosystem, and our choices have an impact.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
It's not just about being a passive audience anymore.
Right.
We're all media producers, in a way.
In a way.
And that comes with its own set of responsibilities.
Precisely. And that brings us to a fundamental question.
Okay.
What is the role of media in a democracy? Is it simply to inform, to report the facts? Or is there a broader social responsibility?
To educate, to spark debate, to hold those in power accountable.
Yes.
It feels like the stakes are so much higher now.
They are.
We're not just talking about the survival of a newspaper.
Right.
We're talking about the health of our democracy.
Well said. And that's why understanding this history, this back and forth between control and freedom, is so crucial.
Okay.
It gives us context, helps us recognize the patterns, and empowers us to be more informed and engaged citizens.
So for everyone listening, whether you're prepping for the UPSC, studying history in school, or just curious about the world around you, take a moment to consider this legacy of control and the ongoing struggle for a truly free and responsible press.
It's important.
It's a story that's still being written.
Yes.
And your voice, your choices, they're all part of that narrative.
And remember, those colonial committees may seem like ancient history.
Right.
But the questions they raise about power information and the role of media, those are as relevant today as they were back then.
That's a perfect note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But hopefully we've sparked some curiosity.
I hope so.
Some new ways of thinking about the media we consume and the world around us.
If there's one thing you take away from this deep dive, let it be this.
What's that?
Be critical, be engaged, and never stop questioning.
Good advice.
The future of a free and vibrant media depends on it.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
If this journey through history has piqued your interest, don't forget to subscribe and like our show.
Please do.
We've got more fascinating deep dives coming up,
Absolutely.
exploring all sorts of topics that will make you think, question, and see the world in new ways.
I can't wait.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those curious minds engaged.